What's your best idiot neighbor story? My dad had a neighbor when he was young that played his radio loudly all day, even when he wasn't home or was gone on vacation. Every time he left the house and his radio was still on, my dad would go and trip the circuit breaker to his condo. One day he sees my dad, who was an electrical engineer, and asked him why his breaker kept tripping. Was it faulty wiring? No, my dad explained. The loud radio was probably just putting too much strain on the circuit when left on all the time. My dad suggested he should try turning it down or off when he wasn't home, and see if that fixed it. So the man tried it, and surprise surprise, the circuit breaker stopped tripping. He was very thankful to my dad for helping him with that annoying electrical issue. Genius. When I was a kid we had this guy living next door who seemed like a nice guy. This is the mid-90s and he had a neon business, so he was doing pretty well for himself. Then he got together with a crackhead and his house slowly started going to crap. Literally. At one point his septic system went up and since they were smoking every dime he made he decided that he was just going to make a cesspit. We live on the east coast in the mid-Atlantic. It gets hot and humid come July. Thanks to this guy, our entire neighborhood smelled like a spotter pot at Midsummer Festival for about 3 months. Fast forward to January, nice and snowy. We come home to our house being broken into. Computer is gone, TV is gone, bunch of movies and meds are gone. Cops show up and they start dusting and looking around. They go outside and lo and behold there are tracks going from our side door back to the neighbor's house. Of course, they deny everything and are at least smart enough not to keep the stuff around after we got home. They were not smart enough to use different names. They pawned everything though. Needless to say, we had new neighbors within a few months of this incident. I live on a 50+ acre New England farm. About 2/3 of it is wooded. After I'd been here for about a year I was walking the boundary stone wall, about 10 feet on my side of the land. From a neighbor's yard I hear a bellowing voice, "You'd better not be on my land." I replied, "I'm not, I'm on my own land." He yells back, "From somewhere in the trees on his side just so you know, never stop foot on my land." Me, "Okay, we've got a deal. And you stay off mine." "Okay." I hear a grunt. Then I ask, "By the way, is this your deer hunting tree stand on my side of the wall?" At which point he exploded, "That stand has been there for 10 years. Neighbor dug a hole in our side yard because she needed dirt. Both of us live on an acre of land. I had a neighbor with a drag racing car. At the time, we didn't have a count. Like clockwork, at dinner time, he would start the car and revved it so loud my windows rattled. If we had any windows open, because it was summer, we wouldn't be able to have dinner conversation. One day, I'd had enough. I walked to the fence and got his attention and politely asked if he could maybe not rev the car at dinner time. I said I was cool with it otherwise. His answer was, "Frick you." "Frick me?" He, "Okay." I went inside and called the police and filed a noise complaint. They came out, heard it live, and wrote him up. He fought it in court, so I had to go. Judge asked me what happened. I told the story above. She asked him and his wife if it was true. They said yes. Boom, $1,000 fine. Judge told me to call the police if it continued. To be clear, I wasn't wasting 911 time. I was calling the non-emergency ordinance enforcement number. All dumbass had to do was avoid 1 hour a day and we'd have been fine. I never called again, because he didn't rev during dinner. One day his common law wife gets in my face about calling again. I told her I didn't, but she wouldn't believe me. He got hit with a second $1,000 fine. Turns out it was the neighbor 2 houses away who was a migraine sufferer and had similarly tried the neighborly approach first. They are lucky they just got a fine from the other neighbor. As a fellow migraine sufferer, when they hit my mind isn't functioning on all cylinders, I'd probably have taken a bat to the car. I watched my across the street neighbor cut his 3/4 acre lawn entirely with an electric weed whacker because he didn't have time to drive a mile to get gas for his lawnmower. I kid you not, this one dude in my neighborhood let his grass get so tall that he couldn't use a lawnmower on it. Was driving one day and saw the sucker with a weed whacker going at grass taller than him. We lived next to this big guy in an apartment building. Front doors inside a hallway. Now, He was a nice enough guy, but he was always cleaning a puddle up in front of his apartment every other day. We'd always ask him if everything was alright, and he'd talk some incoherent crap about how he hates management. So, out of curiosity, I asked management when I happened to be in the rental office, and the lady rolls her eyes and says, "This idiot fills up his tub to the brim and sits his fat butt in the tub. The water, of course, floods his entire apartment and comes out into the hallway, and this idiot has the balls to blame us somehow." I pretty much said, "Geez, sounds rough," and scurried on back to my place. If the tub story is really the truth, this guy must be dumb as rocks. Couple that lives across the hall from me fights often and loudly. One night, the girl found something on the guy's phone that she found objectionable, either pee or evidence of cheating. Either way, she was yelling a lot about skanks and ass, so she throws his phone off the second floor balcony onto the concrete walkway below where it shatters. Guy then goes back inside, grabs her phone and does the same. Moral of the story is, an iPhone for an iPhone makes the whole world entertaining for the neighbors. When I lived with my parents, we had a knock at the door one day from our neighbors across the road. They told us a story that resulted in their car getting stolen the night before. Apparently, the wife had seen a strange looking man wandering around the street late at night. He had apparently been looking into car windows which were parked on driveways, including our cars. The next morning, their BMW was gone, including the keys which were hanging by the front door of their house. They assumed the strange man looking in car windows had somehow fished the keys from the house via the letterbox. The whole thing sounded very strange. To not call the police when a man is literally peering through car windows on people's driveways was strange enough. Months later, the neighbors got a divorce and sold their house. Turns out, they'd made the whole thing up and had dumped the car for the insurance, as they had fallen on hard times. Apparently, their crappy story hadn't held up well, and they were found out. Who broadcasts a story like that? Why make yourself look stupid for not calling the police when seeing a strange man eyeing up cars? Then tell all the neighbors about the man? A neighbor messed up when building a home and put his entire home well within my property. Large piece of land with 2 huge clearings connected to 2 roads but separated by a large isthmus of trees. I didn't notice because I had taken an 8th-month vacation right after he started building. Huge property. I didn't go around and inspect it often, so I got a real estate lawyer and surveyors to confirm it was in my property. I was going to sell him that clearing for a good price until I went to talk to him, and he was the biggest butthole I had ever met. He essentially told me that he is going to sue me for leading him on despite the fact that I did not know him nor did I meet him before that day. His wife flipped my girlfriend and I as we were pulling out of their driveway. 4 months later, I file a lawsuit saying he must destroy the property or turn it over to me immediately. It would have cost him more to demolish it and return the site to original condition, so he signed the house over to me. He was still out for construction costs. I was living in a single wide with my girlfriend. Then I had brand new 2,600 square featuring house with all the hookups for water, electric, and cable for free. Got the land for next to nothing. Sold it for almost 50 times the value. I feel like this is better than winning the lottery. My upstairs neighbors moo at each other very loudly. I used to live in the country and it sounds exactly like a cow, and me and my roommate have no idea why they do it. Nobody believes us until they come over and hear it for themselves. We moo back at them sometimes now if they get too loud, and they usually stop for a while. They're just weird people though. I love that you moo back. My constantly drunk neighbor came up with the brilliant idea that he could collect the leaves in the stone parking lot with his snowblower. He duct taped a plastic garbage bag over the discharge chute, and off he goes. It actually inflated the bag for a few moments until the stones started flying. He broke 3 windows on his garage door and splattered a bunch of cars in the lot. Crap my britches laughing. I could write a book on all the stupid crap I saw him do. Neighbor before I bought the house every day would park but use a wide sweeping arc to get into his spot over my lawn. After asking many times for him to stop, I put an enormous rock directly in that path on my own property. Lo and behold, he smashed into it hard. After threatening to sue very loudly and forcefully, I informed him I'm a lawyer and he damaged me rock on my property and is liable for all the damages to my brand new rock. He stopped driving on my lawn after. Back in high school, one of our neighbors moved away and their house sold to this older woman and her mostly grown sons. She was a strange one. She cut down every tree on her property because of the bad spirits in them. The sons seemed to be popular, having people drop by at all hours. All was relatively quiet until one day, while I was home alone, there was a knock on the door. Two gentlemen in very nice black suits and dark ties then identified themselves as FBI and asked me if we were ever approached by crazy lady or her sons to buy anything. I basically replied with they are crazy and we don't talk to them. They don't talk to us, they hand me their business card then proceed on to the next house. I look out the window and I see 5 blue Ford Tauruses, 3 red Ford Astro vans, and 1 Viacom truck that was being loaded with box after box from the neighbor's garage. Turns out the sons were making those special cable boxes that got you all of the channels for free. After this it was only the strange lady left in that house. My neighbor is an overweight middle-aged woman that seems to have a bad knee only when my kids are outside in the summer. If they are playing in my fenced-in backyard, she'll pretend to fall down so they can help her up. I went from kids, you should help her, that's what neighbors do, to she fell again. It seems like she only falls when you guys are playing. She doesn't fall when I'm working in the garden. To if she falls again, come get me. When I started saying that, she seemed to be able to get up pretty quickly. I had to go over there in August and tell her that I can't have my kids helping her get up anymore. They are 7 and 8 years old and they can't give her medical aid. I get that she is probably lonely, but 3 or 4 times a week, I'd hear her yell, kids help me up. I fell again. I had a prob with a neighbor who drove over my lawn with his ATVs and damaged the grass shrubs. He said he'd pay for damage but that never happened and he kept doing it. So I put my huge trailer across their tracks to block their path. They went around it. I put up 2 other barriers that they also drove around. So I found this huge branch that had fallen in the woods between our properties and dragged it across to cover the 3rd path they were making across my yard. But the branch got caught on a cable. What is a cable doing over the lawn instead of properly buried? So I called the cable company to have it buried. They said I was the only registered client on that box and to disconnect it. So I did. After the weekend, my neighbor came by going total apeshit at me for disconnecting his cable. He yelled he was going to call the cops on me. So I left. I got a call from the cops. Cops asked if I disconnected cable because of the ATV issue. Interesting. I wasn't even going to mention the ATV issue, but my neighbor already did. So long story short, the neighbor got a warning ticket for trespassing and admitted to stealing cable. I took an offer on my house that very day and moved. That guy is a freaking dumbass, calling the cops for the crime he committed. I wonder how many times this happens. I have crazy neighbors. They are actually very nice as neighbors go, but the family is totally dysfunctional. They have 2 grown-up daughters living there, along with their teenage daughters and their boyfriends. One has a kid. There are roughly 10 people living there ranging from 5 to 70. They keep the yard mowed and keep to themselves mostly, but they are batcrap insane. I like them actually for 2 reasons. First, they are notorious and crazy around our town so everyone leaves them alone. So little crime around us. Second, they are entertainment. One morning my aunt was visiting. We are on the front porch and I am telling her about all the neighbors. I was telling her a story about how one of the younger granddaughters gets in a fight with her boyfriend at 2 AM on a Tuesday night. They are screaming at each other, walking up and down the street, explaining that something like that happens once a week. Like clockwork, one of the daughters comes out screaming back at someone and gets in her car. Her daughter comes out and tries to stop her from backing out. She grabs a shovel from the back of the truck and starts hitting the front windshield of the car, shattering it. They call the cops. Meanwhile, the granddaughter with the shovel calls her bio dad who lives down the road. He picks his daughter up. 2 minutes later the cops show up, but she is gone. I have hundreds like this. Your front lawn is like an episode of Dr. Philo Moripovic. I almost envy you. I had a neighbor on our old street who we're pretty sure was on some serious drugs. When we first moved there, he wanted to invite us to a BBQ, but we declined because we were still busy unpacking and said maybe another time. A few months later, we hear a woman in distress. and turns out he was beating his wife in the middle of the street. We called for her to come over here so she could call police or whatever. The wife left him, and some drama between both of them throughout the years. It's irrelevant to us though, because our family helped his wife. We were his enemy and he harassed us multiple times throughout the years. We'd call the police and they'd come out and basically have him stop for a time. At one point, he bought a megaphone and started yelling threats and swears at us. Another time he started driving his motorcycle around our neighborhood to annoy us and then used the motorcycle's back tire to throw dirt and rocks at our car. We called the police who told him don't do this again. He denied he ever did it in the same breath that he said he did because my mom is evil. A few years later I go to get the mail and I hear him talking to his 2-year-old child, basically telling the child the woman over there is evil. Never trust her, referring to my mom. I tell my mom and she's thinking, oh boy, what's he up to now? Later that afternoon he drives by our house very slowly and stops, staring into our living room window. He later goes home and uses his megaphone to insult my mom and yell threats at us again. One specific threat being, you better not leave your kids alone or something will happen to them. My mom calls the police. They recommend a restraining order. The next day and his ex-wife calls us, saying her kids heard him saying he was going to get a restraining order against us. We filed one at the same time so we had the same court date. He told the court that my mom had been training me and my siblings, and an unnamed teenage boy, to climb his fence and go into his tree at night to harass him, and one night he caught us and we all ran back into our house at my mom's orders. Apparently we only harassed him when his kids were at his ex-wife's. He basically spouted insanity throughout the entire court hearing and the judge asked for our side of the story and we told him. The judge asked if our neighbor was taking any meds and he told the judge yes. I was taking antipsychotics but I stopped them. The judge then told him that my family would never bother him again and granted us our restraining order. Dude was completely insane. I worry about how those kids of his turned out. I was off sick one day, and my roommate came home for lunch and checked the mail. We got a letter with no return address, sent to the rooftop pot smokers, with our address on it. We knew it was for our next door neighbors since one of them had a chair on the roof and smoked up there. Since it had no actual name, and our address on it, I was like, heck yeah, I'ma open this, it'll be hilarious. As I'm opening the taped envelope, a little bit of white powder sprinkled onto my lap. My roommate and I looked at each other and were like, UHH, WTF. So I got up and took the letter outside to open it. A crap ton of white powder came out of the letter when we took it out of the envelope. So we grabbed a Ziploc bag and some tongs and sealed up the letter. The letter was typed and said random crap like, to the butthole who likes smoking pot on the roof and yelling at people on the street with kids, you'd better have good insurance cause I'll damage your stuff. I'm ex-military and have nothing better to do than to watch over you, you peed off the wrong guy, blah blah blah. And at the end it said, by the way, the substance in this envelope is toxic, so you might want to get yourself to a hospital. Who's the mother sucker now? At that point we were half laughing, half concerned, so I called the cops just in case. They took it very seriously and sent out everyone. Cops, paramedics, fire trucks, RCMP. My roommate works for them, and the tactical unit, our version of SWAT. The street was closed off. We were quarantined to our garage, and every neighbor who was home at the time came out to take a look. Everyone was told to go back inside and stay put. The tactical team got suited up in hazmat suits and went in our house to test the letter envelope. We were in the garage for almost 3 hours. The tactical guys came back out and said the substance was found to be non-toxic, but they still had to do some more tests to figure out exactly what it was. At that point we were taken into the ambulance for a look over and then back to the garage. Turns out the white powder was fricking pancake mix. My roommate and I, along with the cops and tactical guys, burst out laughing together. We thanked the response teams and they left. The police stayed behind to get our statements and questioned the next door neighbors to whom the letter was supposed to be sent. A detective followed up with us a couple of times. Since it was a threat and sent through the mail, it was a serious offense. The letter envelope was sent off to forensics for testing. Unfortunately, nothing was found and the case was closed. The people in that house caused some crap the entire time they lived there. Noise complaints, trash left everywhere outside, etc. But this incident really takes the cake. Luckily they have all since moved out. Dickbags. What are your worst nightmare neighbor conflict stories? This is more of a funny story than a neighbor from heck, but in our apartment, we kept hearing massive bass, think like a rhythm game, starting at like 6 PM to sometimes going till 11 PM, and it sounded like it was localized right above our bedroom. Finally, one night I go up and bang on the door, but they don't answer. About an hour later, I hear moving around in the apartment above me, so I walk out, hoping to catch them either on the stairs or so I can knock on the door again. I go out, and he's walking down the stairs. When he sees me, he asks if I can turn down the bass so he can sleep. It was like the Spider-Man meme where they are pointing at each other. I told him I thought it was him this entire time. So after we realized it was neither of us, we walked together and found the noise coming from a building 2 buildings down, and it turned out the dude had a drum set in his closet and was rocking out every night. Since we talk to him, we can hear it, but he always stops around 8 PM now, so it could have been way worse if the guy was a dong. That's like, weirdly wholesome. There was an old guy behind named Louis. He was a cranky old fart and had fights with every neighbor. His house's lot was the last on the street, and the crossroad where I lived had 4 lots back to his side. So he had 6 lots adjacent to him and he fought with them all. When I first moved there I tried to get along. I had been warned. I planted a garden and he oversprayed a weed killer over a lot of my plants, including several nice watermelon plants. He'd yell at me. He'd yell at my dog. My wife said he was saying obscene stuff to her. One day he called me a fat hillbilly without a pot to pee in. I called him a stupid old Goomba. He was Italian, and he acted like I really hurt his feelings. This went on for years, and he was keeping neighbors agitated as well. Here's the good part. One day I was at a flea market type thing and I saw him in his little accessibility cart. I tried to stay away. Suddenly from behind me I heard him say, "Hey, aren't you the guy that lives behind me?" I said yeah, and he popped out hand to shake and said how you're doing, and we talked. He was friendly. He told me his wife had a stroke recently and invited me over. I wondering what was going on. That summer he saw me and came out to talk and we chatted. I mentioned I played guitar and he jumped and said go get it and I'll bring the wife to the kitchen and you can play for her. I was stunned. I was shy about playing, but I brought it over and they thought it was wonderful. One day he apologized for being cranky before. I apologized back. Louis and I were friends the next few years. He'd tell me stories of when he was a kid in the 1920s. Just became a good guy. None of neighbors forgave him, but I did. I assumed his doctor gave him Prozac or something. Anyway, he died on the 10th of September, 2001, the day before the infamy. He was a diabetic and took nitroglycerine for his heart. Neighbors said he committed suicide, but I knew another guy that couldn't get his nitro on time and died. I think he had a medical emergency and could not make the call. About a year before he died, he asked me that if something happened to him to check the door on his lawn shed and make sure it was locked. I checked it. It was locked. I've posted this before. A little backstory for context later. I live in a very spacious country subdivision. We are about 25 years younger than the average owners. Everyone has at least an acre. My husband and I personally built a large shed next to a detached bed garage. It took us about 3 weekends to do it. We also mow our lawn once a week. Our yard isn't meticulous but hardly neglected. We got a letter in the mail one day. It was typed on a typewriter and came from the Upper Smith neighbor group. Name changed. The letter read, when you first moved in, I wasn't sure if you had the class, finances or breeding to be in our illustrious neighborhood. I see that you finally built a place to hide all the junk you insist on keeping in your yard. Now if only you could do something about that hayfield you call a yard. The junk they were upset about was building materials for the shed that were delivered, used and cleaning up in 3 weeks. I was so mad and revenge was first on my mind for weeks. I couldn't figure out how to handle it to my satisfaction. I figured it out right before the 4th of July. I got 2 old toilets and put one on either side of my driveway, by the street. I planted red, white and blue flowers in the bowl and stuck in a couple of small American flags for flair. Then made a large sign that read, "Thank you Upper Smith neighbor group for your letter suggesting I take more pride in my yard." I kept them for a whole year, switching out the bowl decorations for every holiday with the wackiest decorations I could find. Good. Let the hate flow through you. Our neighbor kept complaining that the plants by the shared fence in our garden were dragging it down and ruining the plants climbing on her side. You only had to glance at the fence to see that it was massively weighed down on her side. It was sort of a wire fence and it was stretched and bowed on her side so that it practically touched the ground. We had a few plants against the fence on our side but nothing like she did, and yet she kept insisting it must be our fault. When we moved out, we hired a couple of gardeners to just tidy the garden up a bit for the next tenants. We left them to it and went inside to pack. When we checked on them later we found that the neighbor had come in and told them to get rid of all of our plants by the fence, which technically belonged to the landlord, and instead of coming to check with us they just totally ripped out every flower bed along the fence on the say-so of some random stranger. And of course it made no dang difference to the fence whatsoever. As a gardener here, that hurt to read. I'm so sorry. My boyfriend and I had a next door neighbor around our age who we thought seemed alright. Laid back professional. Rented the house with his girlfriend. Smoked a ton of weed. Nothing really noteworthy. His girlfriend eventually left him and we watched the dude slowly lose his mind after that. After a series of episodes of his screaming arguments on the phone or when his ex would stop by, we eventually saw it peak when he took a hammer to his cabinets. Our bedroom window had a direct view of his balcony and kitchen window. I was falling asleep when I started hearing a repetitive banging sound and looked out the window to see his perfectly lit kitchen window. In the window was our neighbor just smashing the ever-loving frick out of his kitchen cabinets. I know the landlord just renovated, and those cabinets were brand new. He was demolishing his fricking kitchen while screaming and laughing, and we could see everything from the comfort of our own bed. He wasn't able to see us, and I remember being frozen while witnessing this man just unhinge from reality like that. I grabbed my boyfriend as a witness to the event and the neighbor eventually calmed down and left the kitchen from our view. I don't think I slept much that night. The property manager saw us outside a few weeks later and told us that he moved. Then she told me she thinks the rental is cursed because it's broken up the last 3 couples she moved in. At the time, we were living in a new construction neighborhood, one of the nicest in town. Our next door neighbor was an older lady who lived alone and generally kept to herself. I was very surprised when she knocked on our front door one day and asked if I would walk outside with her. She led me to her backyard and across to the property line for the next house. A family with 2 young kids had moved in there a few months prior. I knew they had kids because the 2 were always outside, even though it was winter. My neighbor lady asked me if I smelled anything. I did but couldn't identify it. They're cooking in that house, she said. I wanted you to verify the smell so I know I'm not imagining it. She had owned rental houses and had encountered the smell from when tenants ruined one by making M there. I'm worried about those kids. You go on home now. I'm going inside to call the police. Cops arrived soon after. The parents were arrested immediately. The dad screamed menace swear words towards the older lady's house as 2 officers forced him across the yard and into one of their cars. The mom just kept screaming my babies as she was taken to a different police car. I couldn't see the kids, but I could hear them screaming and crying. DCS came and took the kids away. They were the first to live in that new house. It had to be completely gutted and redone inside because of the chemicals. That process took nearly a year. Neighbor lady surely heard everything that man yelled, and she probably risked retaliation if he got out on bail. He didn't, but she absolutely saved those 2 kids. I thought this was gonna be a case of quiet neighbor lady is a massive bee and wants to scold you for some tiny thing, but it was so much worse than that. Glad she was around and got the kids out of there. I don't remember this well, as this was handled by my parents. Ever since we arrived to the building we're currently living in, the water bill, I don't know if that's how it's called, had been insanely high. After years trying to cut showers and stuff like that, they finally called the water company. Turns out the laundromat downstairs, which was owned by another neighbor, had tweaked its pipes so that all the water they used was marked as used by us. Not any business, a laundromat. Eventually it was fixed and we're back to paying a reasonable amount, but I don't remember if we were ever compensated for all the previous years. My dad, who was fighting that, died around the same time. Not related lol. He had cancer. I was told that the apartment across from me had kids but only on every other weekend. So that was a f-king lie. They had their kids there every day. all day, and all these kids did was scream 24/7. The parents would also scream back to them, with the TV permanently set to 90 on the volume. No kids show either. It's 1-bedroom apartments and they had like 5 kids, including a toddler. Oh, how did I know? Their kids tried to get into my apartment twice. They eventually skipped out and I got to see the stuff the cleaners had to haul away. There was an adult bed, a crib, and nothing else. These kids were sleeping on hardwood floors every night. When I looked into the bedroom, there was a kid-size hole in the wall, like someone had picked up and threw a child into the wall. Now I understand why the kids cried all the time. That's so incredibly sad. Those poor kids. I was the admin of the community Facebook page for a nice gated community and I really tried to be a good fair admin. I kicked a member off for calling all the women of the neighborhood useless CTS and saying that all housewives should be muzzled and chained to the stoves where they belonged. So he showed up at my house threatening to burn it down with our dogs inside. We were scared to leave our house for a while. I'd have called the cops if he threatened arson and murder. We had a neighbor who was obviously nuts. They were older and both unemployed and having a rough go of it. So what's an unstable busybody to do? Why? Peek over your neighbor's 6-foot tall solid wood fence to spy. They called animal control on us because the dog's splashy pool water was gross. Not their drinking water. That was an automatic watering system that refilled with fresh water every time they used it. But the splashy baby pool water the dogs like to play in. We asked them, why the frick did you call animal control on us? Our dogs have their own floor of the house. They are hardly abused, they said, hysterically sobbing. We just didn't know what to do. We relocated to another residence after that. They then stole the huge ceramic pots of black bamboo that went on either side of the porch. When we pointed the theft out, they got angry and claimed since we were moving out, they were fair game. This was about 12 years ago. Had a married couple who lived above me. For the most part, they were quiet. One night they got into a fight, a huge fight. There was a bunch of noise, yelling, stomping, doors slamming. She managed to throw him out. He does a Ric Flair who and smashes their bedroom window to break back into their apartment. That is when 911 was called. I was the 5th person to call on that apartment. Spoke to the apartment office about that couple. They weren't being evicted. Their lease was almost up and the apartment office declined their renewal. Was the woo before, after, or during jumping through the window? Not so much a neighbor but a roommate in my dorm. First semester of my sophomore year, me and a guy named Alex became friends. He was a junior and I was obviously a sophomore, and we both were living in a mostly freshman dorm. I had a super crappy roommate who would often steal and throw away my things and claim it wasn't him or that it accidentally got thrown away, or would do other random crap vandalizing my stuff. But the hall director just claimed it was minor things and wouldn't take action. But at the semester break, Alex's roommate dropped out of school, and we asked the hall director if I could move into Alex's room. He agreed and I moved in for the start of second semester. However, things got off to a very rocky start. Alex apparently went to bed at 7:30 almost every night. He also could not sleep through a single peep. Despite there being no AC, he demanded the windows stay shut because the ambient noise from outside was too loud. He also complained that my computer fan was too loud or that me typing on my keyboard was too loud and demanded both stop after 7:30. I would often go to the dorm room next to ours to hang out to not wake him up, but he claimed our voices carried too much and would tell us to be quiet. So needless to say, things didn't go well. Suddenly at the end of April, only like 3 weeks into February, my grandmother had a stroke and eventually died. I had to fly out of town for the funeral and miss a week of school. Apparently Alex took this as a prime opportunity and he called me to tell me I was moving out. But he also waited until the funeral started to call, and left a voicemail knowing both I wouldn't answer and that I couldn't call back for a few hours at the soonest. The call said that he decided to move my stuff into the hallway and I should come get it if I didn't want it stolen. My friends on the floor grabbed my stuff and put it in their rooms to keep safe, but I'm sure some things went missing. I was obviously in no way able to get home that day, nor was I really in the mood to talk to him on the phone about it. However, obviously what he did was both not allowed to the dorm rules but also was illegal, and he ended up getting kicked out of the dorm and I ended up having the room to myself for the rest of the year. What an butthole. Karma caught up to him fast, lol. My friend's new neighbor asked them to stop cooking food because the smell bothered them, but only in the guest bathroom. When she cozied up to the air vent, she suggested that instead of hot, cooked food, my friend should eat lunch meat and nuts. Or should they heat food the natural way? She did not give any specifics on what that meant. Later in the message she said that if they must cook food, they should consider simply not cooking food instead. Eventually she went to the leasing office to complain that my friends were cooking their food. Thankfully they declined the complaint because it was so ridiculous. If you're this kind of person, please never live in an apartment complex. Our first house was in a working class, post-World War II suburban neighborhood. The houses were a single driveway's width plus about 2-3 feet apart, open yards. We moved in early spring, with our then 2-year-old, so we were spending time outside when our new neighbors in their 70s came home. We smiled, waved. They came over to introduce themselves, and the first thing the lady says is, "I have something to say to you people. Don't blow the snow up against our house. If get water in our basement we will sue the crap out of you." Ooh, okay. Nice to meet you too. This was the beginning of the most ridiculous neighbor relationship I think I've ever had. I nannied another little boy, and she would come knock on our door and tell me to shut those dang kids up before I call CPS on you. They were running around my house, that I owned, or the yard, being happy, loud kids. Eventually I had enough and I ended up calling the non-emergency line for harassment. Then things got really weird. She would wake up at like 7 AM and bang on all the windows that faced our house. She'd open them and bang them shut repeatedly. She would pound her fists on them. Then about 7:38, she would walk out to her car after slamming the door and shake her keys as loud as she could. She'd throw them on the ground, pick them up and shake them, throw them down again. Then she'd leave for the morning. She would also randomly come wandering over, trying to give me $1 for my son's birthday, or tearful and wanting to come into our house. I wonder if she wasn't entering into some form of dementia. They sold their house about a year after we moved in. Growing up, the neighbor on one side would shoot the stray barn cats for fun. Broke my heart to find that one out. The other side was a cornfield for years, owned by a guy out of state that paid local farmers to plant and harvest. Then that property got sold and was bought by a family that ran a landscaping business. They would burn green branches a lot, but only when the wind was blowing directly towards our house. We kept track. We lived in the country, but although our properties were quite long, they weren't particularly wide, so their house was relatively close to ours, and a ton of smoke would come in all the time. My dad started having serious respiratory problems due to all of the smoke, and the dad business owner would just ignore us or say he didn't care when we asked nicely for him to stop. Finally, my parents went to a lawyer and got a letter that basically said, "You've got to stop or we'll sue you for medical bills." My mom went to deliver the letter, and it just so happened that the guy's father-in-law was there too. He asked my mom what this was all about, and my mom told him. Phil ripped the neighbor a new butthole right then and there, apologized on his dopey Sil's behalf, and with a very stern look at our neighbor, assured us it would never happen again. And it actually didn't happen again. And my dad recovered once he wasn't breathing smoke in all the time. My parents and that neighbor both still live there. They are friendly with him now. But I just can't forgive being that blasé about making my dad seriously ill. Nice happy ending. I was fairly young, maybe around 4 or 5. I remember my parents always talking to our direct neighbors about people a few houses down. I didn't really understand it then, but they mentioned things like illegal, dangerous, etc. But it mostly went over my head. Then one time most of people on my block came over to discuss these dangerous neighbors. I don't think anything came of it because I don't think the police were ever called. I remember those people a few houses down were a little crazy and definitely scared me. My parents wouldn't let me and my siblings play in the front yard unsupervised. The whole cul-de-sac had issues with this one house. They would have parties every now and then that would get out of hand and was a huge noise issue. I remember not being able to sleep because the music was so loud. Then one day I came home from school and there were fire trucks and police cars on the street, and that one house was on fire. Since I was only 5, my parents didn't tell me everything and just told me there was a fire, and the people who lived there had to move. It wasn't until years later I found out that the people who lived there were some type of drug dealers, and that fire, their lab straight up exploded and almost burnt the house down. The people were arrested and were never seen again. There was an apartment building in my town that was notorious for catching on fire. I later learned the building had been owned by a child molester, and that it was labs that had been exploding. Oh, and the owner's sex offender buddy who managed the building murdered one of the tenants. Growing up, we had a neighbor named Ada. She was a widow and had a big dog. I think it was a Saint Bernard. We were told when we moved in that her dog was mean and had attacked some kids. Her backyard was fenced with a wooden fence and the dog was kept in a chain link pen inside that fence when it wasn't in the house. Our houses were separated by an alley and our yard was sunken a bit and had a stone wall on the outside perimeter. We would often play in our yard and that would make the dog bark. We never did anything to irritate that dog on purpose. We were terrified of it. If we were outside playing, she would yell at us about making the dog bark. One day my mom and I were at the mall. My dad and brother were home on our porch. Ada was walking the dog from her back door to the pen in the yard. The dog got loose, ran across the alley, across our driveway, jumped on my brother's back, he was 5 years old, and attacked him. All heck broke loose. Thankfully my dad was able to intervene before things got bad and my brother didn't even end up at the hospital. However, my dad lost it a bit. He was sure the dog would get loose again, so he brought his gun down from upstairs and made it more easily accessible. A few days later, the dog got loose again and he went out and threatened to shoot the dog. A few days later, my parents got served. They had to go before the magistrate. They needed a lawyer for this and at the time dad was either on strike or laid off, so money was tight. My dad's bill agreed to be their lawyer and they rounded up a few neighbors that the dog had attacked through the years. They went to court twice and the neighbor didn't show up either time. After that, the case was dropped. Eventually the dog died, and she didn't get another, but we never had any real contact with Ada until years later when one of their trees, a huge old pine, was blown over by the wind. It blocked the road and ended up in her driveway. Her garage was a separate building behind her house, just missing her garage. They actually dealt with each other cordially then. Fun times. People don't understand that keeping a working breed chained is going to result into something like this. New neighbor moved in downstairs from me. He and his large group of friends used to sit on the stairs outside of the building leading up to the door and smoke cigarettes and leave the butts all over the ground. They would also prop open the door even though we have a keypad to enter the building that's there for all of our safety. He also likes to stand in the hallway at 7 or 8 in the morning and just blast his music. It can be heard on all 3 floors of the building, but he's been doing it less since a lot of us complained to the landlord. His dog is poorly trained and I once heard him yell at his dog and threatening to beat it. He constantly blasts music in his apartment and plays drums and attempts to sing Screamo, and again this is all heard through the entire building and starts as early as 8 AM and sometimes starts as late as 10 PM. My classmate lives downstairs next to him and once came out of her apartment and saw him sitting near her door in the hallway using an outlet, and he told her his electricity got turned off and he needed to go to the bank and tried to bum a ride off her even though they've never spoken before. One morning, around 10 AM, he was blasting a Nickelback song on repeat and one of my elderly neighbors knocked on his door and asked him to turn it down. He told my elderly neighbor to frick off and slammed the door in his face. A few days ago, I was walking into my building and his girlfriend, friend, sex partner, whatever was in the hallway, talking loudly on the phone and said, "You're lucky someone just walked in or I was going to say what I'd do to you. Just know I'd be better than you." I just went up to my apartment and could still hear her conversation. My building had a lot of college students doing classwork online and families with young kids, so we're all having a hard time with this new guy. If management gets enough complaints about him and they're worth what the building pays, then they'll sort him out at the longest once his lease runs out. Otherwise, call in noise complaints to the non-emergency line whenever he starts that banging after 10 PM. Most places have a standing policy that quiet time starts around then. My neighbor rented his rooms to randos, and once in the middle of the day we say one of the renters in the front yard and washing his naked butt with a garden hose. My husband and him made direct eye contact while we drove by. He did what Reddit loves to do, assert dominance. My sister was looking to buy a 3-bedroom house and she was not having a lot of luck finding something livable that she could afford. She came across a house that was absolutely beautiful. Large airy rooms, big eat-in kitchen, everything updated and decent property size. It had been on the market forever and it was cheap. She was completely mystified until she was shown the property by the owner. Out comes the crazy neighbor, screaming at my sister, swearing, shaking her fist and hollering like a fat granny clampet. She followed them around the property screaming, and when they went inside she stood by the windows and screamed through the screens. The owner basically said, "No way in heck you are going to buy this house, right?" "No." But my sister did sign a complaint and act as a witness for the homeowner. Never been so off at a story here. That lady deserves serious jail time or at least eviction from her property. We lived in a townhouse condo and across the parking lot was a building of apartment style condos. The townhouses got 2 reserved parking spots and the apartments got 1. Butthole neighbor from the condo building has a personal car and a work van and always stole spots until called out on it. It came to a head for me when it snowed like 2.5 feet on a weekday. I worked from home, so I shoveled my spots out throughout the day so it wasn't some huge task. When my wife came home, she came inside all mad because parking lot douche parked in her reserve spot and we couldn't have him towed because of the snow. I walked over and banged on his door to move and he just shrugged and said, "I don't have a shovel and it's the only spot open and I'll be gone for work in the morning before you can have me towed," and slammed the door. I was pissed. So I had to shovel out a visitor spot next to the spot he stole. The lot was 2 reserved, 1 visitor in sequence, so there were plenty of spots for him. And decided that the best place for all that snow was under, around and on top of his old butt rear wheel drive work van. I may have even poured a bucket or 2 of water under and on top of it to ice it all over. After I'm 80% done, his wife comes home and sees what I'm doing and runs in to tell him and he comes running out like he's gonna start something. But I'm 6'5" and 275 pounds and both really pee off and holding a metal snow shovel. So seeing that I'm not gonna do crap to help him, he calls the cops. The cops show up and I tell them exactly the sequence of events above and fully admit to being an butthole, and that I hope he learns his lesson. The cops basically tell him rough crap. I haven't damaged his car or threatened him or any other actionable thing and that he needs to dig himself out. While they were there I also took pictures of both of my vehicles and the cops basically told the guy that if they had to come back, he was gonna be the one in trouble. So things got bad after that. And I'm sure I'm his story he tells for an butthole neighbor as well. And we're probably both right. But I gotta say, watching him dig out 2.5 feet of snow packed under his car with his literal hands while I sat on the porch and sipped a beer and waved with my snow shovels was very karmically rewarding. Also, we moved from there like 8 months later, so we didn't have to deal with him much longer. This is more funny than horrific, but it sucked in the moment. My old flatmate would frequently bring home girls, and this one girl he brought home was particularly vocal. Think of anything and everything you'd expect to hear a P-star say, and she screamed it, like everything. The next night he was out, but our neighbors had hatched a plan to get back at us. They proceeded to imitate everything they had heard the night before, but even more dramatized. But who was ultimately punished? Me. This went on for a couple weeks until he stopped seeing her, but I swear to God he was never home when the neighbors were retaliating. SMH. Maybe your flatmate and his girlfriend just went next door. Our neighbors had 6 kids under the age of 5, all boys, and they were all loud little shoots. Mum would leave them outside to play by themselves, and when they weren't beating each other up and screaming, they were pushing their slide up against our 6-foot fence and throwing rocks at our dog or jumping down into our yard to chase her. Once their 2-year-old climbed into our dog door and gave me a heart attack. Picture the girl from The Ring, only a red-headed toddler. Another time, someone was suddenly banging on my back door. I went to open it and a naked, soaking wet 3-year-old ran past me screaming into my house, out the front door and straight towards the pond across the street. Their mother yelled at me to mind my own business when I returned him to her. They cloth diapered, used the family cloth and made their own hippie detergent, so when they ran their dryer, it smelled awful. One kid broke his arm badly and she posted on Facebook asking for advice on which was better and waited 5 hours to take him to the ER while he screamed in the backyard. Oh, and she gave birth to 3 of them, 1 kid and then twins a year later, in her master bedroom with all the windows open. They were renters and we once saw the 4-year-old hitting the 6-year-old with what looked like a stair banister. I felt so bad for the people who owned the home. Also, we moved away. That is a really sad situation for those kids. But I so want to imagine that mom was a mommy blogger who posts serene photos of cloth diapers neatly folded, and how home births are so much more holistic. I had a neighbor with a work truck, custom truck, and a custom car. He had so many vehicles that it was hard to park. When our second son was born, a 4th truck appeared. He rebuilt the thing. His yard was full of body panels instead of grass that summer. He was always using a metal grinder. He rebuilt the engine and took months to tune it. He'd back it up to as close to our house as he could and would rev the engine. Before work, after work and all day on the weekends. It was impossible to have conversations in our house. He would stop if we left. He would start things like this, create conflict and would act like the victim. Eyewitness: he yelled at cable installers, the landlord's brother who repainted the house. We were at odds because my cat went into his yard the summer before. So after pretending it wasn't getting to me, I called the cops, who blew it off and told him he couldn't do it after sundown. Sundown doesn't happen until 10 PM in Montana. I finally emailed a community resource officer and he shut that down. For the next 2 years the guy would film me doing something wrong. He had 6 cameras pointing out from his place to ours at all angles. If I was taking out the trash, he'd come out with his phone camera and try to catch me doing something. I dunno. Eventually his landlord evicted him. He still lives close and spent his summer evenings holding up a sign that said, "Screw your masks liberals at EUMB." I don't know what it means, but he wore a mask every time he went to the store. It is scary how many of those crazy people are out there. Growing up, a friend of my brother's lived next door to an elderly widow who became obsessed with a feud with that family. She was constantly calling the police on them. She claimed that they had dynamite hidden in the basement. Another time she soaked herself, clothing and all, in a shower, then came out after calling the police and claimed that the father had sprayed her with a garden hose. I'm sure I'm forgetting a whole pile of her antics. It was kind of sad though. She probably just wanted some attention. I lived next door to an Airbnb house. At first, it was fine, but then during tourist season the house was rented out to some dude that decided to invite all his boys over for a lovely party on a Tuesday till after midnight in the pool next to my bedroom window and blocked our driveway with their cars. We spent the next 6 months calling the police, non-emergent line, for one thing or another as a barrage of events unfolded. Other fun mentionables were loud pool parties till 2 or 3 in the morning, goth metal music blaring from a stereo that made our windows shake on that side of the house, garbage left sprawled on our yard, cars parked in our driveway when theirs was full. I eventually contacted the owners through the Airbnb listing and explained that if they couldn't find tenants that could respect the residential area that I would be happy to talk to the whore about putting in an ordinance against short-term rentals for our area. Needless to say, after 6 months of BS they put the house up for sale and we finally had a nice neighbor that moved in. Peace at last. Blocking and using your driveway. That is not even unintentionally. That's just being an butthole. I hope you called the tow company each time that happened. My neighborhood is fairly new, and the construction results in a vole problem in any new sodded yard. My next door neighbor has tried multiple methods to rid her yard of the voles, including spreading human hair, sprinkling vinegar, or maybe it was turmeric. Anyway, her latest vole removal effort involves lining her property line with used, bulging puppy pads as to deter the voles. We live in the northern United States. These pads are now frozen solid. The first layer is frozen to the ground and has a few inches of snow covering it. She just started the second layer. I have talked to her, and the neighbors on the other side and behind her have spoken to her about it. She refuses to stop because any other option will harm her dog and her 15-year-old son. All 3 of us have complained to the city and public health. When these things melt in the spring, it will be more disgusting than it is now. Tenfold. 2 brothers moved in across from us in an apartment building. One was sketchy AF and kept trying to get me to let him in when my husband wasn't home. He would do weird things like had my husband call the cops because he claimed his brother stole our wedding presents. After that his brother kicked him out. Eventually we caught up with the brother and apologized for the whole thing. And he explained that his brother was into serious drugs and was causing him all kinds of problems. We felt bad but best to stay out of it. The guy seemed a little slow but otherwise okay, and with the drama over we all settled back into being neighbors. A month later he was arrested. He'd been tackling and raping women as they jog in the nearby park. Seriously derailed at the end. New apartment neighbor had a sound system on his shared wall with our bedroom and his living room. First night, he had a party, like friends, beaux, weed, and strippers. Yay, strippers. Our bedroom wall was actually shaking. In total, I went over there about 6 times. Every time it was I have the bass set to 0 so IDK what you're talking about. Had a 6-month correspondence chain with the property company to the point where the next step was eviction. He had a nice habit of getting drunk and passing out until 4-5 AM with his music on. I tried all the how to deal with noisy neighbor suggestions, but there isn't a whole lot to block out bass. Thankfully I got into a grad program in another state and pieced the frick out within a month. Sleep deprivation seriously sucks. What does your crazy neighbor do to be labeled a crazy neighbor? Threatened to put giant signs across the wooded border between our properties if my other neighbor got into another border dispute with him. This was after stopping my excavator from doing his job, finished grading the lot so we could plant grass, and threatening him if he got over the property line. He was 50 feet away from it and not taking down any trees. He finished his rant and left without ever introducing himself. When he's not complaining to the cops about my neighbor, he's doing everything legally possible to annoy the cops themselves. I had a neighbor who would sneak into my yard at night and roll up my sod. It would be laid perfectly the night before, but I'd get up in the morning and it would be rolled up just like it was when it came from the store. I finally got pee and spent the night laying by my back door with a baseball bat and a flashlight, ready to bonk the crap out of whoever it was. Sure enough, they came around 2 in the morning, and I stood up, turned the light on, and was face to face with 4 raccoons rolling up my sod, looking for bugs. He was hopping my fence during the day when I was gone at work to use my backyard pool. When confronted, thanks to a snitch neighbor, he claimed he had an agreement with a previous tenant that he could use the pool whenever he wanted. Guess what? I'm not the tenant. I have a bunch of security cameras now. I was dog sitting, probably about 16 years old. My neighbor charged into the house while I was there with a gun, pointing it at my head, and while on the phone with the owners of the dog claiming there's an intruder, real life ain't Call of Duty. I remember you, Daniel. Frick you. Seriously. Had a neighbor who wouldn't let anyone use his driveway because he didn't want it to get dirty, anyone including himself. He parked on the street outside. If he thought you were having a party, he would drag a bunch of plastic bags full of God knows what to the end of his driveway so no one could turn around it. One time I came home and he was outside hosing it down in the rain. To his credit, I've never seen a cleaner driveway. Our neighbor would leaf blow during a windstorm. It wasn't autumn so there weren't any leaves on the ground, just some other debris. Used to live in a little town of 300 people where we had an elderly neighbor named Gladys. She would routinely look near our garbage can outside and take the recyclable bottles and cans we would leave for her. After we cleaned out a fish tank, we put the gravel and fake plants in a bag and left it on top of the garbage can because it was already full. About a week later, Gladys hollered at me while I was outside to come over as she wanted to show me something. She had taken that bag we had left and planted the fake plants along the side of her house. She said she wasn't real confident that they would make it, but so far they seem to be thriving. I could only nod and compliment her on her green thumb. Better than me, who just did the opposite. Moved my daughter out of college and stuffed her plastic succulents into a box. Weeks later she asked where the plants were so she could water them, but they actually survived. Tough little things. My neighbor sits in his yard, hides behind his plants and meows at people who pass by. He is not dangerous at all, but he is not right in the head either. His caretakers are his parents and they seem to be very nice people. His dad once told me he just likes to be a cat and left it at that. I didn't ask any more questions. I would also like to be a cat, so I see no issue with this. She has a penchant for going around sticking nails in people's tires at night. This has happened dozens of times to nearly everyone on the street, though she's slowed down since more people started installing video cams and motion sensor lights in their driveways. Years ago we had a guy in our neighborhood like this. He stopped hitting our house when my crazy butt mother came flying out the house around 3 AM with her baseball bat. He eats my flowers. In his defense, he told us that he has been doing it for years when he introduced himself after we bought the house. He also brought over frozen cookies in a plastic bag as a housewarming gift, but wasn't sure what was in them. We share a side yard, and as he was talking to us, I noticed his all brick house was actually roofing shingles, layered to look like brick. It started to register that he may be a little out there. He's a great neighbor, just an older, eccentric stoner who keeps to himself and eats my flowers. No shame. Comes over to my yard and eats my lilies raw, or brings scissors and clips the heads to boil and make jam. It's crazy to me, but we have embraced it. I planted a couple raspberry, blackberry, and blueberry bushes 3 years ago when we first moved in, on the side yard we share, as well as a few knockout rose bushes. I told him to help himself to berries roses anytime, especially before the birds do. The bushes have all gone insane and the entire side of my house is now a yearly buffet for my neighbor. Having a decent relationship with a crazy guy I share a property line with is worth some dead-headed flowers. Your neighbor might be part goat. We had one a while back that had a REM lab in the home. Crazy fights, yelling at all hours of the night. Dude would wander around the hood tweaked out crazy, and once he threw a Molotov cocktail out of the second floor window at another dude who was smashing up his car, screaming, "I'll fricking kill you." Mother, those were interesting times. Pulled us over pretending to be a police officer, saying that we had somehow broken the law whilst pulling out of our driveway and that she was going to call it in. She isn't a cop, lol. Pretty sure that's a crime. Well, I used to have a neighbor who was legitimately mentally ill, although I don't know his actual diagnosis. His truck wouldn't start one day, dead battery, and he told everyone on the street that another neighbor was stealing the electricity. He knew this because of the way this guy parked his vehicle. Obviously it was sucking electricity from the ground for his battery, which drained the car batteries near him. Many times he would run down the street and warn everyone to hide their valuables because Japan was invading the country. He wasn't on drugs, but he did take medication for his mental illness, and everyone on our street could tell when he stopped taking it. Whenever he would start saying completely irrational things, we would remind him to take his medication, and he would thank us and go home, presumably to take it. He lived alone, and he was getting older, so I think he had a hard time remembering to take it. There were many more incidents. ETA, thanks for the rewards. I've never gotten any before this post. I'm glad the neighbors at least cared enough to remind him to take it. He jumped in front of my car while I was driving down the road to yell at me for going through his trash at night. Told him it was probably raccoons. He refuses to believe it to this day. This is my favorite one. Instead of moving his trash or getting locking lids, he stalks your car at night to throw his body in front of it to protest your suspected raccoon-like activities. All the while, the trash pandas are in the background, having a freaking field day with his trash. I used to live in a hoa. One of the members on the board lived across the street from my neighbor and I. He sent a letter to us saying that we all have to mow the lawn on the same day, at the same cut height, and in the same pattern to create uniformity in the neighborhood. My neighbor and I intentionally cut on different days and in opposite patterns just to annoy the guy. At my last place I had a neighbor that would mow my lawn if my lines weren't straight enough or if I missed a spot. Never found out who it was, but that was an incredibly fun summer. Only happened that year too. Took my parents to court because he lost an our chairman election. Some people just have too much free time. Next door lady standing on her driveway yelling at me because acorns have fallen from a large oak tree on my property onto said driveway, demanding that I cause the tree to cease and desist from this intentional criminal activity. Fun fact from a law student: trees do not in fact have the legal capacity required for intent. Poisoned our dog once. I have a hedge in front of my house. When it gets trimmed and a single freaking leaf falls on her driveway, which she cleans every day, due to wind, she gets angry. One time she just let leaves blow onto her driveway. She then picked all of them up and put them in a bag, which she hung on my door, saying that it belongs to us in an angry voice. One time in 2004, my mom participated in a TV show where a singer would visit your house and a professional chef made food for you and the singer. She constantly yelled at the camera crew and tried to hit their equipment with a broom. This woman lived next to us who needed to have the police called on her at least once a week. She would scream at her roommate at all hours of the night, go into a drunken and sometimes drug-filled stupor, and scream at us while tripping out as we sat in our backyard. More than once I had to kick her out of our home because she walked in unannounced, beer in hand and drunk as ever. One time I called the police because she was screaming about killing someone and rolling around on her front lawn. Another time I received a call at work, 1 in the morning as I work third shift. My GF informed me they had to evacuate the house because the neighbor's garage was on fire. Turned out either she or her roommate had done it while doing drugs or smoking in the garage. She ended up moving away but would still walk to our house to ask for our lawnmower. She was not happy when I told her to get off my porch. Years ago in rural Arizona we shared a pond with the crazy neighbor. More sad than anything, he was in his 40s and lived with his mother. Around 1988, a Vietnam veteran, he would walk out to our shared pond with a .45 and a box of 50 rounds. He would then absolutely unload on the pond while yelling, "Police is brass," and walk quietly home. This happened every 90 days for about 3 years. In all likelihood, he was fighting a swamp monster that emerged every 90 days. My sister's neighbor reported my sister to the police because her kids were playing in my sister's garden. Not for the usual reasons, too much noise etc. Nope, because a volcano in Italy had erupted and the radiation would hurt them. My sister lives in the UK. Mayo. I would have loved to see the police's face when they heard the reason. I cared for an elderly woman for many years. She lived to the age of 93 in a crime-ridden inner city neighborhood by being as tough and nasty as any criminal living nearby. Her oddest actions involved her incorrect belief that she owned the road in front of her house. She didn't even own a car, but she insisted that nobody park there. She would confront them if they parked in front of her house. If they did it again, she slashed their tires in the middle of the night. Over and over for years. She was never caught, but everybody knew it was her. She only stopped when she lost the physical strength to slash a tire in her mid-80s. Then she started using spray paint on the cars. "He don't park in front of my house no more," was all the justification she needed to damage her neighbor's cars. He had 3 little trees in his front yard and one day lemons appeared on them. We were like, whoa, those lemons grew so fast, and on closer inspection we realized they were fake lemons. This older lady lives across the street from me and she is obsessed with leaves falling on her lawn. To the point that she will come out of her house and pick up one individual leaf off the grass in the fall, or any other time. She spends hours a day outside with the leaf blower in full. She will go and knock on other neighbors' doors if she thinks you have too many leaves on your grass. She'll come over into your yard and do it herself if you're not home. What I think is weird is that she's in her 70s, no kids or grandkids living with her, and lives alone in a pretty large 4-bedroom house with an amazing in-ground pool in the backyard, with a slide and diving board and everything. Nobody has used that pool in at least 5 years, yet she opens it up every summer. Somehow she likes my family and has never once yelled at us about our leaves, and randomly brings things over like half-eaten gallons of ice cream and asks if we want it because she's not using it. Sounds like she's lonely bored. The old lady who lived below me left me multiple cryptic letters blaming me for the birds chirping too loudly in the mornings. Not pet birds, the sparrows and crap outside. This went on for months. When I first moved in, my neighbor walked into the house, unannounced. When my wife gets home, sometimes she wants to stay in her car having a phone conversation. He will come out and walk down the side of his house, checking his sprinkler controls, and looks at my wife. He has 2 huge bushes he refuses to cut. It blocks our view of backing out of our driveway. The fire department came by to clear trees and bushes around the fire hydrants. The neighbor came out and yelled at the fireman. This bush is older than you. Needless to say, I hope there are no house fires. She stalks us. Like every time I get home she'll walk outside and tell me I was either 3 minutes later getting home this time or that I'm home 2 minutes earlier and then ask me why. One time my friend and her sister came to pick me up. The neighbor was against her window with her hands and face pressed up on the glass trying to look at who was coming to pick me up. My friend and her sister were so terrified they called me telling me to hurry up BC a crazy lady was staring at them through a window. I replied, oh, it's just the stalker neighbor. That was a funny day. We bought a house and on the day while we were unloading the first truckload, the neighbor came into our garage uninvited and started telling us what trees on our property he wanted us to cut down. Not the craziest but the fucking audacity of some people. Not sure if this counts as crazy but I have this neighbor who is part of a spiritual organization called Brahma Kumaris. Every time someone in the neighborhood is going through rough times, especially deaths in the family, she goes to their house and instead of offering condolences she preaches how they should join this organization and things will be better. She doesn't acknowledge anyone the rest of the time except the time when someone dies or a new family moves in the neighborhood to whom she preaches and gives books written by leaders of the organization. Yikes, it sounds like a cult. The adults in the family let their small, but surprisingly aggressive, dog out unleashed and without a muzzle. We live right next to a very busy road and public sidewalk and the dog will often chase children and bark at other dogs, cars, people. It's a mess and they ignore any reasoning. Funny enough, their children always have the dog on a leash and apologize if he goes after anyone. Those are good kids. Had severe anger issues and yelled at anything or anyone he didn't like on the street. A few years ago he had a road rage incident and when he started banging on the other car's windows the occupants got out and beat him badly. During this he had a heart attack and now barely has enough mobility to walk to the mailbox and back. Also he doesn't yell anymore. If you are not ready for face punches you are not ready to punch faces. We came outside one day to see him pouring bleach on the patio. Asked him what he was doing. He tells me the bugs are back. You see them? With their little wings? No bugs. I didn't have the heart to tell him. So I said you must have better eyes than me. Dude clearly has schizophrenia. Apparently he's had exterminators in 3 times in a year. I keep thinking about the kind of person that just says oh yeah I see him. That'll be $750. The neighbor behind us had a leak in his water pipe and, rather than fix it, he just had the sump pump drain it out into the backyard. This meant that all year round the back of our yard was a little bit damp. Eventually, the leaky pipe burst and filled the house with 5 feet of water. His solution to this was just to keep the pump running and flood the entire neighborhood. After about an hour, a posse of all the neighbors whose yards were being flooded confronted him and called the city to shut off the water. The city fixed the water pipe and the neighbor ended up with a large fine. At least my yard stays basically dry now. I should also mention that this neighbor once rented the house out to a bunch of sickheads and it nearly burned down because the ex-girlfriend of one of these morons snuck in and set the house on fire. I've heard way more than I need to about their health ailments and bowel movements. One night I'm in the backyard sitting in lawn chairs watching the stars with the wife when she pops out with a flashlight in our faces. I went off. What the fucking heck are you doing? She apologized and left with no explanation. I could go on, but then I may start thinking about moving again. I'm sorry but what the frick. Ours is the classic retired old man. Terrible health and literally nothing going on in his life. He's not married, and I try to stay out of everyone's business, but I don't believe he has any kids. Rarely has visitors. I think he had a dream once of being a police officer but never quite made it, so he's taken it upon himself to be the neighborhood police person. He spies on everyone and makes it his business to know everything. My favorite encounter was catching him literally camping out in my front yard bushes early morning, spying on neighbors a few doors down. He had a coffee mug, notepad, blanket, literally just hanging out in my front yard making notes about the weird folks who were likely doing drugs at home. When I asked him what he was doing, he just didn't seem to understand that it was inappropriate. He seems to like us so it's nice, I guess, but he creeps me out. Called the police on people parked perfectly legal in front of their house. Took pictures of my partner's dad just working in the yard. disappeared suddenly without a trace and then suddenly come back home in the dead of night 8 months later. Weirdos. That sounds a lot like jail. Quite possibly for stalking. My neighbor moved onto a plot of land that is not his, but claims it's his family's. Moved a bunch of trash onto the land. Came over to my house and demanded my husband and I allow him to use our private road and our utilities. We said no. We farm 20 acres of our land which happens to be located around the plot he lives on. Long story short, he started trying to sabotage our land and our farmers. He would post videos to Facebook saying our farmers were harassing him. Then one day the neighbor got 2 friends of his to come and attack our farmer, which resulted in his friend's death. A neighbor fled the scene and ended up in a neighboring state. He was summoned by the police to come and clean up his property within 30 days. He came back for one day, and the one day he was back his trailer mysteriously caught on fire and burnt down. Neighbor ended up fleeing again, until he was subpoenaed into court for the death of the other guy. For reference, the neighbor has a rap sheet about 12 pages long, including burglary, touching children, abusing his ex, stalking, MUs, etc. And so did his friend who got killed. Sad he got killed because he was pulled into his friend's stupid mess. As his friend was dying on the ground, my neighbor had the decency to pull out his phone and go on Facebook Live. No attempts to aid his friend or anything. Meanwhile, the farmer was on the ground putting pressure on the wound and bawling his eyes out. Before I moved out of my parents' place, the neighbor on the other side of the backyard fence was always doing crazy crap. He'd be practicing shooting his BB gun down his yard, at the fence, while my dad was doing yard work just on the other side of it, or in the middle of the yard, or just minding his own business. Really, my dad and I got absolutely pee one time because our neighbor decided to try practicing with a .22 rifle while my dad was outside with our German Shepherd. There were 2 instances where the neighbor trapped 2 skunks, on separate occasions, in a live animal trap, killed them himself, then threw their bodies over the fence to stink up the entire yard and neighborhood. By extension, he then tried to tell the neighbors that it was my parents' fault. My dad simply cleaned up the messes, disposed of the skunk remains properly, then told the neighbors the truth of the matter before the wacko managed to. It helped in our defense that our other neighbors already viewed the guy as the crazy neighbor. My dad also invested in a camera system and set it up on the shed just by the fence. Oh well, the neighbor's dead now. Heart attack or some crap. I forgot what my dad said, and his yard has become a huge mess and eyesore because his widowed wife refuses to do anything about it. He took it upon himself to mow my lawn while I was at work. My mower broke and I couldn't get it fixed. Needed to wait until next payday. Ran over a rock in my yard, damaged his mower, and asked that I pay to replace the blades. Dude, I didn't even ask you to mow my lawn. Had a neighbor mow my lawn for me while my mom was on vacation and our mower was broke. I went over to thank him. He was drunk and cursed me out for being lazy for not mowing the lawn. Country boy moved to the city into the house next to mine. Landlord had done a terrible job with upkeep, so the backyard was covered in dead brush and overgrowth. Country boy saw country boy problem and employed the best country boy solution he could think of. He lit it all on fire the day after he moved in. She calls the city on everything. Ever walk out, look at your yard and think, yep, I need to mow this weekend. That is the point where my neighbor will call the city and complain that my lawn is too long. If I park on the street, she will call the cops and complain that my car is an abandoned vehicle. Even though it has current tags and is parked in front of the house it's registered to. The cops got tired of dealing with her and told me I need to park in my driveway and that I cannot park in the street or they'll tow my vehicle. If she sees my dogs outside, she calls animal control and claims they're being neglected and abused. She is currently going around the neighborhood telling people that I am poisoning her cats, which I'm apparently doing a horrible job of since the cats are healthy and very much still around. She is a truly awful person who is very much mentally unstable. She doesn't just do this to me though. Other neighbors on the block complain about the exact same thing. The cops will tow you if you park in front of your house. You need your property taxes refunded then. My guy was married but lived totally separate from his wife. She would visit every so often and he would travel to her too every now and then. Always wondered about that until I got a chance to be invited into his house. A hoarder of garage sale stuff. Dolls and just doll heads scattered around and boxes of toys. And whatever else you can imagine. Only a 2-foot path throughout the house. He also had a overgrown yard full of all kinds of plants. It was kind of cool looking, but seeing an overgrown jungle after some years was a bit concerning. Nice guy, and we would share a beer all the time. My best neighborhood friend. My parents' next door neighbor Nancy started with a no trespassing sign in the backyard that faces our yard and nothing else. Set up a motion activated floodlight that faces the side of our house and nothing else. She stabbed our ball when it landed in her yard when we were children. Called the cops on the neighbors because their dog barked constantly despite them not owning a dog. Thinks my mother, the sweetest person you can meet in this world, is a backstabbing traitor for warning the new neighbors not to let their kids play on Nancy's lawn. Verbally assaulted me for chasing deer out of our flower garden, etc. But the true ficho moment came with the trees. We had large trees along the property line, just barely on our side, and she was starting to go all psycho about the tree is gonna fall and crush her house and demanded it be cut down. We consulted an arborist who said it did not but could use a trim that would make it impossible to fall on her yard at all. The entire time they were trimming, she stalked the property line and screamed if anyone stepped over it. While this trim was happening, a single stick fell on her lawn. She lost it, threatened to call the cops, told them they better have all their licenses up to date, etc. Arborists tried to blow her off, but my mom insisted they check. Sent someone to City Hall and renewed their license. 30 minutes after that, a cop showed up to check as Nancy had called them. Arborists were super thankful for my mom warning them. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.